Hello and welcome to React Native Radio. I'm your host, Nader Dabit. Today on our show, we have a special guest who has been here before to talk about something completely different, Vladimir Novick. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good, dude. I know the last time you were here, I think you were talking about VR and AR. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm doing lots of things in this field too.
I mean, you do all kinds of stuff. So you still kind of do stuff with VR and AR, but you also do a lot of other things. Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad. So give us a quick intro, who you are, what you do right now, and the things that you've been working on over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. So I'm basically developer advocate at Hasura, and I will talk in a bit what Hasura is. But in addition to being developer advocate, I'm also a consultant. We've been consultant for several years, and I work in web, mobile, VR, AR, as you mentioned, IoT fields, and I mean, it's a lot, right? So I like to say I kind of build cyberpunk future in a good way. I even have stickers for that. And recently I'm doing lots of stuff with GraphQL and serverless because, like I mentioned, I work for Hasura. So Hasura is an engine that auto-generates GraphQL API for you. And basically it can use any existing or even new Postgres database, can auto-generate all the CRUD that you want. But beyond that, it will also give you lots of things like authorization, permission management, eventing system, and so on. It gives you basically a full I would say it's not like a full backend, but it's an engine that gives you an ability to construct your serverless and GraphQL backend in the way you prefer to do so.
Cool. And so today's episode is really going to be around the combination of serverless and GraphQL. And I think it's a really good topic for me and Vladimir because we've been both specializing in that, I think, over the last 6 months to a year. On my team at AWS, we build SDKs for React Native, React, and a lot of web frameworks. And basically all the services that are implemented through these SDKs are serverless. And one of the main ones is GraphQL as well. So we have some good context there. And we'll also talk about some of the other opportunities out there for using other services, other providers, and how you can get into it in general. So let's start with what serverless is. And, I would assume most of the people that are listening maybe have heard of GraphQL and kind of know what it is, but maybe we can give a brief overview again of why, in our opinions, people might use GraphQL and what GraphQL is.
Yeah, sure. So what do you prefer to start with, serverless or GraphQL?
Yeah, let's talk about serverless in general. I've done quite a bit of writing about this, and I have a book coming out about this and doing some talks and stuff. And I think what I've figured out after doing a lot of research in general and talking to a lot of people in the industry is that serverless is less of a solidified thing. Like you can't go and find a shared definition of it. It's more like a idea or a philosophy of building your application and using different services that are categorized as serverless. And what that really kind of means to me is if you're managing your own infrastructure, then it's probably not serverless. If someone else is managing your infrastructure, your service for you, then it could possibly be categorized as serverless. So things that I think, in my opinion, fall into the category of serverless are managed authentication providers like Auth0 or Okta, managed databases like Firebase or Firestore, I guess it is, and things like that. Any managed service like a storage service, so there's Cloudinary, there's all these things like S3. I think those, in my opinion, categorized as serverless. And, Vladimir, what do you think? Do you agree with that?
Well, I think when we define serverless, it's I mean, initially it was serverless because there is these functions that they run. There's no server running all the time. They have specific start time. They are started, then they execute the logic, then they go down, right? And that's where it came from. But eventually, I actually really liked your blog post about like stateful serverless, right? About the fact that serverless functions, it's in a way it's also servers, right? But it's a different approach. So when I think about this approach, I really like the idea of three-factor app architecture proposal. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, I've heard you talk about it, but I'd like to kind of get a good overview, and maybe everyone listening would be interested too.
Yeah, sure. So actually, we will share also a link to the document describing that after this episode. So the idea of three-factor app architecture proposal is basically to rely on three main factors for architecting your architecture, basically. And it's reliable eventing, it's real-time GraphQL, and async serverless. So what it means I like to compare it to sort of like Redux for the whole stack. So if you think from the React Native perspective, React perspective, and state management, Redux has these reducers, has a state, it has actions, right? So if you think in this mind model, you can say that, okay, fine, I have GraphQL endpoint, and this GraphQL endpoint, I query this endpoint, or I do mutations. Let's say I execute mutation on this GraphQL endpoint, and it writes states into database. Now, my database is a state. Now, whenever I write something into a database, there is a venting system that is triggered, and a venting system will execute different functions, which will execute in turn their own business logic, and they will write it down back to the database. Now, what happens, because we are talking about real-time GraphQL, we're talking about subscriptions, every change in the database will be propagated to the client, and the client will do the whole reloading and all of this. So basically, it's sort of like Redux for the whole stack, right? Whenever your database is a state, your eventing system triggers actions, and your actions basically execute. They trigger execution of these serverless functions. So I really like this kind of approach. And I think lots of companies moving in that way. I think right now, if you think of like services that provide you with like engine and with all this eventing system, is Hasura and AWS. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you can trigger serverless functions on S3 changes. You can trigger serverless functions on different changes in AWS, right?
Yeah, they're basically, people refer to it kind of like as an event-based architecture where you can trigger an event from a database operation, like posting, updating, deleting something in a database, uploading an image, doing something in the AWS services in general. There's dozens of ways, I guess, that you could do this. But I just recently kind of wrote a blog post around resizing an image. You know, if you upload an image, how could you maybe resize that image? And basically what happens is you upload an image to S3, that triggers, that sends a trigger to a Lambda function with the information about the image. In that Lambda function, you resize the image, and then you put it back into the database, or in the storage, you put it back into storage, and then you kind of are done, and that's kind of it. And if you think of it, a lot of things can be done in this way, and you know, it kind of fits into the serverless model. Works really well with an event-based architecture because you can kind of do a lot of work behind the scenes. You trigger one action, and then everything else is kind of handled in the service, so you don't have to do anything else on the client. You just have one operation, a bunch of stuff happens, and it's kind of really powerful.
Yeah, that's right. And like recently, we also in Hasura Engine we released so-called remote joins, and basically what we can do, we can now you can now connect your like CRUD GraphQL API to literally anything. Your microservices, REST APIs. Basically anything, and you can use these. You can use eventing systems for even migrating your old stack to GraphQL, and it's kind of cool. And if we talk about like where can it bring us, I recently had this experiment, and it's kind of fun and kind of spooky experiment, Black Mirror style. So there is this neuroscience field, right? So EEG headset that you can basically read people's minds, not literally, but you can understand if a person focuses on something or if basically mostly if a person focuses on something or if a person winks or does specific facial expression, you can understand that from brainwaves. Now, the cool part is that you can connect them with web Bluetooth to your browser. Now, there, what you can do, you can actually post all this data and store this in AWS. Now, whenever you will put all this data into, like, process this data and put it into Postgres, I can run Hasura Engine on top of Postgres, and basically, I like to say it, I will auto-generate GraphQL API of your thoughts. And it's kind of spooky and Black Mirror style-ish, but it kind of shows the way, like, there is no limit, basically, to what you can do with the serverless. There is no limit what you can do, because all of these is based on triggering these functions. Whenever you upload the data, you trigger the processing of data, and then the processing will trigger something else, and then in the end it will be written into database, auto-generated, and if you subscribe to your thoughts, then something like that. So it was just a cool experiment that we did, that I did, and yeah.
Yeah, if you look at my GitHub repo, I actually have a pretty cool example of this that I put out there. I haven't published it yet because I haven't really polished the design and the UI itself. But the actual repository is live, and you can look at it. But I haven't written anything about it yet. It's called SMS GraphQL UI, and it's basically an event-based app, and it allows you to text message Markdown to a phone number, and the Markdown then gets handled in a Lambda function. The Lambda function triggers a GraphQL mutation with the information from the text message, which is Markdown that you send again in the text message, and then it stores it, in the database. And then I have a React app that's listening on the client, and then it is listening for subscriptions. So when you send a text message, it basically shows up in the UI, and it's kind of like a way for people to do real-time comments in events and actual like conferences events, not event-based architectures. So like if you're an event and you want to have people be able to text message information to the conference speaker or to the organizer, or you want to just have some like real-time dashboard or something showing up, you can basically give the phone number to these people. They can text message to Markdown, which means they can send images, they can send code, all types of stuff, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, but man, it can go so wrong with giving phone number.
Oh yeah, there's no way to verify. Well, actually, in the event, you have the phone number of the person that sent the message. But it's anonymous. There's no authentication, of course. There's nothing there. People can.
But the funny thing, I'm talking here about like it's dangerous to share a phone number. Well, when I talked 5 minutes ago about sharing GraphQL API of your thoughts, right? So, I mean,
this isn't like my phone number. It's like a phone number that you can basically set up phone numbers in AWS through Pinpoint, and it's kind of like Twilio or something. It's just a tear down phone number. Like you throw it up there, you tear it down when you're done with it. It's not anything that stays around. So.
Yeah.
So how does GraphQL fit into this? And that's kind of like going to be the main topic. We're going to be talking about serverless GraphQL really, and how GraphQL fits into the serverless paradigm. I think for me, the cool thing about what's happening over the last couple of years is, so GraphQL came out 5 or 6 years ago. Serverless, the paradigm has been out a little bit longer than that, and I think we're seeing the maturity of both of these tools, and people are building better and better abstractions. I think with the idea of serverless GraphQL, we're basically seeing ways to build out and deploy GraphQL servers much easier than ever before. And you can actually do this as a front-end developer, and you don't have to understand distributed systems and back-end architecture and building out your own APIs. You can actually use some of these tools and get up and running with a full stack app with a GraphQL backend as a front-end developer. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about all this stuff.
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that are exciting about the GraphQL in general, and I would say it's not only exciting. There is lots of people say GraphQL is exciting because frontend can do lots of stuff, right? But there was one talk, I don't remember right now whose talk was that about, but I will find out. I will share a link to it about why there was a saying there that what can be good with GraphQL and what can be bad, right? And whenever you pitch GraphQL to the company, or you talk about in general why GraphQL is good to front-end developers, they totally understand that, right? So it's really easy. But when you talk about GraphQL to backend developers, sometimes people don't want to lose control, sort of, right? Because they feel like front-end now have control over everything. And what about security? What about lots and lots of stuff that previously were dealt on backend? And I think the main point is to understand that GraphQL is good for both worlds. It's good for backend, it's good for frontend, right? So if you think about all the all solutions on the backend side that we are using, like caching and stuff like that, right? Caching initially. That was the main reason why caching was invented and why caching was used and is used for REST endpoints. But it is used also to solve lots of problems in REST APIs. And the main problem is you have overfetching or underfetching. When we talk about overfetching, is just getting too much data whenever we don't need all of this data, because of we don't want to create every lots of endpoints for lots of apps. If you share web and mobile, you will probably, with REST, you'll probably have different APIs, or you will just have too much data sent over the wire. And underfetching is the best example. Like to talk about is just when you have a blog post with the user and you query REST endpoint with a blog ID, with post ID, with bunch publication ID or something like that. You get bunch of posts and you want to just display an avatar of a user, and then you need, for every post, you need to query user endpoint for every user. And the amount of traffic that is sent over the network is huge, right? GraphQL deals with all that fundamentally, right? On the backend and on the client. And I think the main problem, understanding why GraphQL is good, is if you go, at least what I have seen, if you go to official GraphQL docs, you will see this sentence: GraphQL is a query language for your API, right? So some people think that GraphQL query language is a query language for API, meaning you need to have your API, and GraphQL is just a wrapper, which is fundamentally a wrong concept, right? GraphQL is a spec how to implement, basically connect all your, resolve all of your data from any data source that you want, in the way that client can query this data in one single query, right? Instead of hitting lots of endpoints. And I think clarifying on that topic is what a majority of really viral blog posts are hitting, basically, we need to clarify why GraphQL is good for both worlds, because it's basically transforming the whole ecosystem, being better, being able to get more data in less network bandwidth, and something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with GraphQL in general, all of the benefits that a lot of people that are using different, not only the services like that we work with, but just the spec in general, a lot of the things that I hear are the performance boost from the underfetching and overfetching that kind of goes away, and then the subscriptions, the real-time implementation. I think those two things alone, and then of course the idea that you get a typed graph, you get a typed schema, you know exactly what information, you know exactly how the app works just by looking at your schema. Those three things, I guess, combined are like the most compelling reasons that I hear from customers that are using AppSync and using GraphQL in general.
I mean, like when you start using GraphQL, and sometimes you take as a given that you get the data from your query and it's just as it's supposed to be, right? In the format that it's supposed to be. And when you use GraphQL a lot, you just take it as a given, but with the rest, it's not the case. Like how many times you got null when you expected a string, or got undefined in the same REST call, right? And with GraphQL, it just cannot happen because of the type system, as you mentioned. And subscriptions is the whole world by itself, right? Getting like real-time updates without dealing with all these like sockets connection and stuff like that. Obviously, if you use something like Hasura, if you use something like AppSync, right, you get subscriptions out of the box, and you don't need to worry of all of these data transfer through WebSockets and all these like reconnection whenever there is like a failed WebSocket connection, or supporting lots of concurrent subscriptions, stuff like that. All of this is taken care of for you, right? And I mean, this kind of transforms how people start architecting their apps. And not only that, it transforms how people think about future of their existing apps, because they can't only migrate their existing apps to GraphQL. It's a no-brainer.
So what are the options out there right now for serverless GraphQL, but other than the two that we work with? So like I work with AWS. We have AWS AppSync. Vladimir works with Hasura. They have the Hasura. What is the actual service called? Hasura?
Yeah.
So Hasura. Both of those seem to be pretty popular. Prisma, I think I would categorize as that. Is that still the case? Would you categorize Prisma?
I'm not sure. Like they recently released Prisma 2, right? And to be honest, I haven't looked much into that. But Prisma was even before releasing Prisma 2, they were mostly ORM. So it was it was sort of ORM. So basically, you need to have your own server, and you have to use Prisma for auto-generating bunch of stuff, but you have to have your own service, opposing services that we represent, right, that give you this out of the box.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and then before Prisma even came out, there was GraphQL, I think, by the same people, and they've done
the same company.
Yeah, same company. They've done a good job of building tooling for sure for GraphQL. So, and then there's GraphCMS. I think GraphCMS is like a different approach, but it's also similar. What else is out there?
So I have I think that's the main players in GraphQL thing. Oh well, there's Apollo Engine also.
Apollo Engine, right. But is that a serverless implementation, or is that
the thing is both, like the graph? I'm not sure about Graph CMS, but Prisma is definitely not serverless implementation. So when we talk about like eventing and we talk about all of this kind of stuff, so maybe in Prisma too, but I'm not sure if in Prisma they gave this ability to like trigger events and stuff like that. So as far as I know, If you look for like three-factor approach, a eventing approach with real-time GraphQL, there are basically just AWS and Hasura doing this. And I might be wrong. I mean, I cannot like I look at the market and what's out there, but maybe there is something new I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I think one other that I don't know if it would also fit into this exact category, but maybe somewhat. Microsoft has a database that they released recently an abstraction over it. The database is a serverless database, and they released a GraphQL abstraction over it. I don't remember the name because it's fairly new, but definitely, if you're interested in using Microsoft products, I would Google that and try to figure it out. But yeah, I mean, there's more and more tools that are coming into this space, and I think that we're going to see even more and more things that come out over the next couple of years. We're seeing a lot of people, a lot of big companies and stuff adopting GraphQL in general. And then the people that want the abstraction or reaching out for things like Hasura, Prisma, AppSync, if they want to have a more managed solution to that. And I would not be surprised if we saw some other, big players come out there in this space.
Yeah, I mean, we have like use cases with Fortune 500 companies already using Hasura in production and like pretty happy with the results. And we also adding like recently we added this remote joins, which is like a huge thing right now. Like you can basically write any custom logic that you want, connect any microservices that you want, REST APIs or anything to Hasura, and basically can do anything. Like you can even like there are some clients that are not using Hasura for just CRUD API. They just use the authorization permission model and the eventing system. You totally can do that. It's kind of sort of like a modular thing, right? So you can use just your database as a state and rely totally on your own databases or on your own implementations somewhere else, and just combine all of them into Hasura.
So what if people want to use Hasura and they want to then also integrate with maybe other cloud providers or maybe even other managed services that are outside of Hasura? So things like, I guess, maybe Auth0 maybe as an authentication provider with Hasura, or maybe using Hasura with Cloudinary, or using Netlify. I don't know, one of these other things that are out there. Is that something people are doing, and is it pretty easy to kind of do that?
Yeah, totally. I actually streamed a bunch of streams of doing that, specifically with Auth0. And it's funny you mentioned Netlify. We have a stream tomorrow with Sean on building custom auth with Netlify and Hasura. And basically, the idea is in Hasura, if you want to integrate with authentication providers, any authentication provider, right? What you need to do is to have, we basically support several types of authentication. One of them is JSON web tokens, and the other one, like JWT tokens, right? And the other one is custom like web-based auth hooks, right? The main idea is either from JSON web tokens or from custom auth hook, you need to return specific format of JWT claims or headers or stuff like that. It's like described more in depth in docs, and I also wrote a bunch of blog posts about that, which I guess we'll just include them in picks section. So basically, whenever you pass these variables inside the engine, in Hasura, you can do really granular permissions to row and column level with lots of edge cases that you can think about, and basically gives you really granular approach to your permission management, roles management, all stuff like that. So this is for authentication provider. And I cannot think of authentication provider that you cannot integrate. Like previously, it was the case with providers that don't support custom JWT claims, but we kind of have a workaround that will be working with Netlify that doesn't support custom JWT claims. We'll still be doing that with custom auth hooks. And speaking of like external APIs, you can use the new feature called remote joins and basically wrap these REST APIs. If you have like REST API that you want to integrate, you can use one graph service, for example, that wraps this API with GraphQL. And you can basically bring it into the engine, or you can use your own microservices, or you can use like lots and lots of basically anything. So yeah.
So let's talk about how we can actually integrate all this stuff with React Native. And I know that GraphQL is well suited for mobile, and a lot of companies are picking GraphQL up because they're looking to distribute their applications all around the world, places with low latency. And with GraphQL, you can just ask for the data that you want, and it's just very well suited for these types of applications. And there are also SDKs out there that allow for offline, for offline use cases, which is another plus for GraphQL. But so say that, let's just talk about GraphQL in general. If you're looking to integrate GraphQL with your React Native app. And I guess this starts with the client implementation. So what are the client SDKs that you see people using with React Native with GraphQL?
Well, there are a few. Actually, there is not a new one, but they recently released also a new version. So the first thing that people think about and start using is Apollo client, and we actually released a bunch of tutorials on how to do that. I was also one of my picks in the end of the episode. But basically, you can use Apollo client for both getting the data from the server and even using it for local state. So you even with GraphQL, you can just use only GraphQL, even for local state management with Apollo client, right? Now, I know you have with the Amplify, right? You have this also like GraphQL client. And there is Urkel, which is kind of new player in this field, and they recently released a new version. I really like their approach. What they have sort of like middleware-ish system that gives you an ability to write your own custom transformers to the data, or basically have these sort of a modular approach, which I really like. And I actually need to release the episode on my show, Refactor Radio, where I interviewed Phil from Formidable Labs, who was the one developing the Urkel, so he talked more in depth about it. Yeah, so these are the main three players. If we're talking about JavaScript and TypeScript, if we're talking about ReasonML, there is like bindings, Reason Apollo, also like Apollo client, but bindings for Reason. And I mean, GraphQL and ReasonML, it's even better than in JavaScript and TypeScript, but we probably shouldn't get into ReasonML because it can be like totally another episode.
Yeah, we need a separate episode for that for sure.
Yeah.
So I think with GraphQL calling these APIs, all you need is a JavaScript client. It doesn't have to be really React Native specific. So any client that works on the web should work in React Native. And like Vladimir mentioned, I think the top two that people are using right now are Apollo and Urkel. And then if you're using a specific service, they might have their own client. Like we at AWS have the AppSync client and the Amplify client as well that work really well with AppSync. And then if maybe other service providers like have their own clients that work better with those services. So if you need to send any special headers or you need any certain type of encryption or things like that, the clients might handle that for you if you're using a managed service. But yeah, you could probably get things done with just those main ones, Apollo and Urkel. And then what I've written recently was I've done some stuff on Node interacting with GraphQL servers from a Node.js environment, maybe from a Lambda function exactly is what I've actually been doing. And what I've actually been doing is just writing my requests using fetch. So, or using Axios. So you can actually use Axios or fetch as well. And all you need to do is just do a little manipulation of the GraphQL operation, whether it be a mutation or a query, and just send that along with the request, and it should work, but it's actually a lot more work. So the GraphQL clients essentially just kind of abstract a lot of that stuff away and allow you just to pass in maybe a query definition, a reference to a query definition or a mutation and also work with variables as opposed to like doing a lot of that stuff on yourself. So
it's not only that, the graphical clients, they give you like caching, they give you lots and lots of things here, right? But yeah, sometimes I see it a lot, and I actually do it a lot on when we talk about three-factor approach, right? So whenever event is triggered, a serverless function, basically it needs to write back to a database, right? And I don't need to actually connect to a database because I already have a GraphQL endpoint, so I can just execute mutation on database. And here you're right, I need to use some kind of client to do so, right? So instead of having Apollo client in Lambda, running Apollo client in Lambda function, I also use fetch or I use Axios. And the important part to understand about GraphQL in general, that is just a post request, and it has specific format of data that you need to send. And your specific GraphQL syntax is just stringified and send in the request as a query object. And in variables object, you will send variables that will get into this query. So yeah, it's not rocket science. It's really simple to do, but all these GraphQL clients, they abstract lots and lots of things that you don't want to write them every time on your own. They also give you an ability to like modularize things and change things as you see fit. So there is no reason of not using them.
Yeah, and good point about the caching. That's definitely one of the main ones that you're going to get out of using something like Urkel or Apollo or AppSync or Amplify. I think that the caching is still kind of fairly a young thing in the GraphQL space. Like there's a lot of improvements that can be done, and they are being done. And you see that with some of the new releases from some of these clients. There's better and better caching implementations and more improvements in making it better. And there's a lot of interesting things happening there. Some of the stuff that we're working on, you might see some really interesting stuff coming out around caching with Amplify in the next couple of months too. So looking forward to that. So what do you recommend people looking at if they want to I guess, get started with I guess maybe Hasura in general, and then maybe just serverless and GraphQL and serverless GraphQL in general?
So we actually released really huge library of tutorials, and it's constantly updating. It's if you go to learn.hasura.io, these tutorials are not Hasura specific. They just general GraphQL tutorials, right? And they teach you in 2 hours of both videos and my hands-on coding. They will teach you basic principles of GraphQL and best practices of how to use GraphQL with different methods. How to, let's say we have the for example, if we talk about subscriptions, right? Lots of people just subscribe to everything, and it's not performance inefficient, right? So instead, there are techniques to subscribe to only the last element, that use subscription as sort of a trigger. But I won't go into that. Just look at the learn.hasura.io. We have tutorials for React Native, ReasonML, Elm, Android, iOS, Flutter, Angular is coming soon, Vue, and obviously we have also Hasura tutorial there that will get you started actually in half an hour, not in 2 hours, but get you started in half an hour with the working GraphQL API, even from your existing database. So if you're using Postgres in production, you can just, you connect to your own database, run the engine, you will see all of your data, all of your GraphQL API auto-generated. Now, the important part that I forgot to mention in the beginning, Hasura is not like a hosted service or something like that. It's an engine that you can run anywhere. So it's you can run it locally and basically anywhere where Docker can run, you can run the engine. So you can run it any cloud whatsoever. And we also have lots of, that if you want to start with GraphQL, you go to learn.hasura.io. Apart from that, we have on our GitHub, we basically have kind of monorepo and community section there. In community section, you will see tons of examples of using serverless functions in different languages and different authentication methods, different authentication servers, integrations with a bunch of authentication providers, lots and lots of content. And also on our website, there are a bunch of like not only the docs, but bunch of links to different use cases and different ways how you can not only use Hasura, but learn more about GraphQL in general and serverless in general.
Yeah, I've seen those tutorials that you all put together. Those are excellent. And I definitely +1 on those. If you're looking to learn GraphQL in general, that's a good place to start. So yeah, this is a really interesting and exciting topic for me. I think this is going to be kind of the future of where, in my opinion, software development is headed. A lot of these managed and serverless services are kind of bringing the stack that used to be inaccessible to front-end developers accessible, or it's basically making it accessible for us to build, not only just build out full stack applications, but build out full stack applications that can actually scale and that we can actually use in production and that are real world. Things that used to take teams of, maybe a dozen developers to do, build out authentication, databases, APIs, all this stuff can be done now by a single developer, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, we've done that on the stream in an hour, right? In an hour, we've done GraphQL API. We've done authentication with Cognito, with like a production-ready authentication in an hour, with us just doing this on the stream. We have it on our YouTube channel, so on Hasura HQ YouTube channel. And I mean, it's amazing we can do these things, right? I had this a story from ViewConf when I was about to give a lightning talk, and 15 minutes before my lightning talk, I realized there's no internet connection, no tethering the phone, and the whole example was in the cloud. And I was like, okay, like previously, let's say several years ago, what could I do? I could probably just explain it without example, without like live coding or something like that. But actually, in these 15 minutes, I had time and enough time to just get all of the infrastructure that I had and replicate this locally using Docker and using Hasura, and just running that, giving this like live coding on stage. And it was pretty amazing to have this experience, and several years ago, it wouldn't have been possible. And right now, people can focus on developing things that actually matter and not focusing on this heavy lifting, because there are lots of services that provide that. And and if we talk about the future in general, so you mentioned I talked about AR in my last episode, right?
Yeah.
And recently I did a bunch of talks on using both AR and GraphQL and serverless, and this is like definitely the future. Now we need to add there the neuroscience thing, and it will be definitely cyberpunk.
Well, this has been pretty awesome. And if anyone wants to find you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle, or where are you located on social media in general?
I'm not creative on Twitter handle, so it's just Vladimir Novick and on Twitter, as simple as that. And most of things I do on Twitter, I have my own website. You can also see it on Twitter. It's vnovick.com. But if you want to follow for updates and stuff like that, all of these you will get from Twitter. So that's the main place to look for new content. And I try to release on a weekly basis blog posts and stuff like that. I also try to stream on Twitch on a weekly basis. So yeah.
Cool. So I guess we can go ahead and get to the picks. Do you have any picks today?
Yeah, so I have the learn.hasura.io that I already mentioned. It's basically these tutorials that I mentioned. I have our YouTube I have our YouTube channel, Hasura HQ on YouTube. I have my own website, which is in the process of like rebranding and like rewrite. Will be probably published this week or next week. I will share a link with you. So I will be doing online workshops for React Native with AR, with IoT, a bunch of cool stuff. And there is no like date for now for that. It's just general interest form. So I will share a link. And if you're interested, hearing more about React Native animations or AR or React Native and IoT and stuff like that, feel free to express interest. And whenever I will have the specific amount of people that are interested, I will schedule a date and we'll keep it rolling.
Cool. So my picks, I have 2 picks. One is the Aria Hotel in Vegas. We stayed there a few weeks ago, me and my wife, and it was the best experience I've ever had in Vegas. It was so much fun. The restaurants there are awesome. The prices wasn't that bad either. And it's I've stayed everywhere. I've stayed at the Wynn. I've stayed at the Bellagio. This is the best hotel to me. And then my second pick is an app that I released 2 weeks ago. It's called Conference App in a Box, and it's written in React Native, but it's also written in Expo. So there's 2 branches, one for React Native and one for Expo. You can actually deploy an event app using React Native or Expo, both the front end and the back end, in about 15 minutes. I've already started working with maybe a dozen or so conferences. So if you're interested in putting on an event, check out that app. It's on my GitHub repo. It's open source. And if you need any help, you can actually reach out to me on Twitter. I'd be happy to help you getting it up and running. You can theme it. You can design it to fit your conference and logo and things like that. All right. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks for coming back on, Vladimir.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. And that wraps up this episode, and we'll see you next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly.